Hi, good morning. How are you?
Yeah, good morning. How are you, Mr. Barton? To begin with, congratulations on publishing your book in Korean, The Fabulous, The Room Where It Happened. Okay. There are well-known two Boltons in Korea. One is the Michael Bolton. And the other one is John Bolton. With this book, I am sure that you're much more famous than Michael Bolton in Korea.
Well, I don't know about that, but thank you very much.
I brought the two books here, the original version of the your book, one, and the second one is the Korean version here. So can you see?
Yes.
Oh,
I
okay,
can.
okay, wonderful.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
I think I need your signature here on.
Okay. I'll be in Seoul. I'll be in Seoul soon, I hope.
Oh, really? Okay, wonderful. Before we deal with four major issues, which is the outcome of U.S. presidential election and on North Korea, on China, and on ROK-U.S. alliance. Would you introduce about your book to Korean leaders first?
The Room Where It Happened is an effort to explain to people how decisions in the national security arena were made during my time in the Trump White House as National Security Advisor. And I felt this was important to do across a range of significant issues so that people who are not in the room where it happened have a better understanding. They get I think some understanding from the news media, but that's often very haphazard, often biased, almost always incomplete. And I wanted to give them a fuller story. And I felt this was important to do in the US in particular, because we have a presidential election on November the 3rd. But I was also writing for history because I think historians and scholars and people who are interested in foreign and defense policy would benefit from seeing what actually happened through history. And in that sense, I wanted to be as complete as I could be. Obviously, no publisher gives you an infinite amount of space, so I didn't include everything. But I wanted it to be a book of facts. I wanted to be a book of what actually happened, not just my opinions. Obviously, my opinions are in there. But I wanted people to see what happened in U.S. dealings with China, with Russia, with North Korea, with Iran, with Venezuela, and a whole host of other issues as well.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, then let's go to the presidential election in the United States. The United States media is categorizing you as a Cold War conservative and a very strong interventionist, and criticizing you as an America First man without hesitation, and also unilateralism over multilateralism. You've been a staunch conservative from your boyhood. I see your careers, and amazing. And then would you tell us what values are most important to you in foreign policies?
Well, I did start in the Goldwater campaign in 1964. In somewhat more contemporary terms, I think of myself as a Reagan conservative. And his foreign policy was based on the principle of peace through strength, that going back to ancient Rome, the way to avoid war, the way to avoid conflict is to be strong enough that your adversaries would see that the cost is and the risk are too high in trying to pressure the United States into doing things it doesn't want to do. The U.S. is a country with global interest. We have trade and investment everywhere. We have connections with the societies where people have come to live in the United States. We have friends and allies all over the world. So in that sense, the U.S. is the world's only global power at this point. And I think that means that we are best served by having strong alliances with like-minded countries. It doesn't mean that multilateral organizations like the UN or anything that we think really can keep the peace. We think the peace is kept through strong collective defense alliances. And so to protect our interest and to protect the interest of our friends, we think it's important to have a strong defense, a clear, consistent foreign policy. and as I say, strong alliances with countries that have similar interests and values. So that's the way I would look at it. I think you look for the principles and interests that that the U.S. needs to defend, and I think the course of action that you take depends on what you think in any given situation would be most likely to advance the interests that you've identified.
Okay. May I categorize you as a classical realist in political science?
Well, you know, I don't much like these labels. Everybody's got labels. I like to say if you want a label, if it's all right, if you want a label for my foreign policy, it's pro-American.
Pro-American. Oh wow. Okay, I'm pro-Korean.
Absolutely, you should be.
Okay, let me be straightforward. And then, who would be the next U.S. president in your prediction, or who should be the next president for the United States?
Well, I think it's very hard to say who the next president will be. The polls suggest that Vice President Biden is ahead, but everybody in the U.S. is traumatized by the 2016 election where people thought Hillary Clinton would win and she didn't. So the polls are not as persuasive as they would have been in earlier elections. I think as of now, my best guess is that Biden will win. But a month is a long time in American politics. I mean, we've just had the president in and out of Walter Reed Hospital because of the coronavirus. That saga isn't over yet. We have 2 more debates to go. Okay. So 2 more presidential debates. Tomorrow we have the only vice presidential debate, which this year will be more important given the age and health of the 2 presidential candidates. But probably I'd say if I were to bet, I would bet $1 that Biden would win, but I wouldn't bet any more than that. In terms of who should win, I'm not going to vote for Trump. That's the first time in my adult political career I have not voted for the Republican nominee. But I'm not going to vote for Biden either because I don't agree with him philosophically, as I did not agree with Hillary Clinton in 2016. So I'm going to write in the name of another person, which you can do in Maryland, which is the state where I live. And it's not a good choice, I think, for Americans. I don't like one of the 2 of them will win. Trump or Biden will win. There's no doubt about that. And I'd prefer that we had another choice, but we don't.
Oh, do you think you're not going to run for the presidency?
No. I think I've considered it before and decided not to. But I do think for the Republican Party in particular, after the election, if Trump loses, it will be very important to have a conversation about what went wrong, how he got the nomination in the first place, and to try and avoid that again. Because I think it's been a very destructive time during his presidency. I think the damage can be repaired. I'm very confident of that. But I would worry if there were 8 years of a Trump presidency that some of the damage could not be repaired, which is why I do hope he's only a one-termer.
Wow, it's daunting. And then, relating to the outcome of a presidential election, what is certain and what is uncertain in U.S. Foreign policies?
Well, I think that Trump is an anomaly in American history, and he's not a conservative, he's not a liberal, he's Trump. And as I explained in the book, many of the decisions in national security in his first term were based not on the merits of the policies under examination, but on what he thought the political reaction would be if he went one way rather than another. And that's not the right way to make foreign policy. But in a second term, the political consequences for Trump will be even less than in the first term because he will have been reelected. He doesn't have to worry about facing the voters again. So I think his policies in a second term become even harder to predict than they were in the first term. I think America's interests remain the same, notwithstanding who is president, but obviously it would be a big difference if Biden came in. I think his administration would look a lot like the Obama administration. But I think many things are changing. I think, for example, American attitudes toward China are changing. And I think even a Democratic president would be tougher on China than the Obama administration was.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to the North Korea issues. And then what is going to be the U.S. North Korea policies after the presidential election? Is there any difference between Trump and Biden?
Well, I think Trump doesn't fully understand what he's dealing with in North Korea. He never has. He doesn't think he needs to understand this. He thinks he can take someone like Kim Jong-un, size him up quickly, and that the two of them can make a deal and on the nuclear program, and subordinates can figure out the details. I don't think that's the way it works. It obviously didn't work for Trump over more than 2 years of his diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. But I think the tendency for Trump is to make a deal without regard to what the substance of the deal is. So I think if he wins, he will be right back to it. You know, we have talked before about an October surprise in American politics. We've actually maybe already had the October surprise because of the president's contracting the coronavirus. But another October surprise could be a fourth meeting with Kim Jong-un. I think that's less likely now than it was before. I don't think they're going to let Kim Jong-un anywhere close to Trump for about another 3 or 4 months anyway. But when Biden, if Biden wins, I think again he would likely go back to where things were in the Obama administration. But there's no guarantee of that. And I think it's also fair to say, unfortunately, that foreign policy has not played as much of a role in the election campaign as we might have expected. So Biden has not had the need or the opportunity to say as much about his foreign policy as it would take to really understand what his direction is.
Okay. In your book and the Financial Times interviews, you insisted to take serious consideration of a preemptive strike against North Korea. Do you think it is the only or the most effective solution to solve the North Korean problems? And then actually Trump criticized your hawkish way in dealing with North Korea. And so you wrote in the book, Kim Jong-un seems to have a little will to denuclearize. And so what solution would you suggest to resolve these problems? And do you still think the Libya model is the best choice?
Well, the Libya model, which President Trump never understood, had as its centerpiece Gaddafi's understanding that he was better off not having nuclear weapons and having made a strategic decision from Libya's perspective to give them up. Kim Jong-un has not come anywhere close to a decision to give the weapons up. He wants the best of both worlds. He wants freedom from the sanctions. He wants economic assistance, and he wants to keep the nuclear weapons program. That's unacceptable. And that's why, to me, to have the United States at risk from a regime like the North Korean regime with deliverable nuclear weapons is unacceptable, and why you cannot take the military option off the table. Now, the North Korean case is very different from Iran or Libya or Iraq or the other proliferation cases, because there is a way to deal with North Korea, and that's to reunite it with South Korea. That was something that I think we could have pursued with China in a number of different contexts. I'm not saying it would be an easy discussion, but really the only long-term solution and the best way to get stability in Northeast Asia is to get rid of the North Korean regime. Now, that doesn't mean regime change in the case of Kim Jong-un. It means reunification, which is an option that the other proliferation threats didn't have. People say, well, China will never agree to that. Look, what they're worried about is that a nuclear North Korea, not to mention China's own increasing nuclear capabilities, will induce Japan to go nuclear. And that's what they don't want. And they don't like American forces on the Yalu River. They saw that movie in 1950. They don't want to see it again. That can be resolved as well. The division of Korea is unnatural. But I think that's something that everybody should keep in mind, that we're not going to get reunification with North Korea because Kim Jong-un suddenly has brotherly feelings toward the people of South Korea. I think that's what's wrong with the Sunshine Policy. We could get reunification when China decides ultimately it's in their interest to see that happen.
What is your suggestion to Korean government and the people in dealing with North Korea? Is there any possible way of engaging North Korea coexistence instead of a maximum pressure or preemptive strike, that kind of sort of? You mentioned North Korea would not abandon its nuclear, weapons. So we can anticipate an endless conflicts between the South and North Korea just waiting. So this is a quite dismal, future. So do you have any, suggestions?
Well, look, as long as North Korea continues to be the world's only hereditary communist dictatorship, I don't see any path of compromise. I think Kim Jong-un, who did impress me when I saw him in Singapore and Hanoi, as somebody who's firmly in control in North Korea and fully understanding what he thinks he needs to do to keep himself in power. That the idea of opening up in a substantial way to South Korea or anybody else is impossible. He fears that if he does that in a small country, his regime will fall. And so, for example, in Hanoi, I remember the press was in the last meeting we had, and they left, and Trump said to Kim, "You have trouble with the press in North Korea?" And Kim said, "No, that's a strange question to ask. As if what do you mean? Of course, I don't have trouble with the press in North Korea. They do exactly what we tell them to do." He's not going to change, and it's not the kind of regime that can accept openness. For example, in the nuclear field, in order to verify any commitments that North Korea might make to denuclearize, you need extensive verification and compliance activities. And those activities alone would be enough potentially to destabilize the North Korean regime. When the people of North Korea see international observers running all over North Korea, they're going to say something has changed here. And I think Kim understands that. So the path to dealing with North Korea should have as its objective reunification. I think we should be clear about that. I don't think South Korea should mess around with it. Why shouldn't the goal be reunification? But we shouldn't think it's going to happen because the North Korean regime agrees on a gradual basis to disappear. They're not going to do that any more than the East German regime would have agreed to disappear. The regime in East Germany collapsed because the Berlin Wall fell, and the people of East Germany said, "We're done with this government." Now, it's not the same with North Korea. I understand that. But the logic of reunification is something that we should all pursue more thoroughly.
Then let's move on China. Okay. What is going to be the U.S.-China policies after the presidential election? Is there any difference between the Trump and Biden? And then many experts saying U.S.-China strategic competition or the relationship already entered the era of new Cold War or second Cold War. Do you agree with this kind of diagnosis?
Well, I don't think it's a second Cold War because I don't think it's ideological. I think this is a question of two different kinds of systems. I think the Chinese system is authoritarian. You can measure that by what they do to their own people with social metrics and the repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, what they're doing in Hong Kong, and what they do internationally. I think the policy of most of the rest of the world toward China for the last 30 to 40 years has been based on the assumption that as Deng Xiaoping abandoned Marxist economic policies, that China would grow more wealthy, which it has, and that would lead to two outcomes. Number one, China would behave more responsibly in international affairs, which it is not. It continues to steal intellectual property, engage in forced technology transfers, discriminate against foreign businesses and investors, and pursue mercantilist trade policies in the WTO, which is supposedly a free trade organization, and it has behaved belligerently in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, along the border with India, building up its military capabilities in nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, cyberspace, anti-satellite weapons, a whole range of very troubling activity. And the second supposed consequence was that China would become more democratic, that these elections in remote villages for headman would spread to other villages, and then they would spread to the provincial level, and then they would spread to the national level. It's exactly the opposite. Xi Jinping is the most authoritarian leader since Mao Zedong, and there's no evidence that's going to change. So what we're seeing here is a fundamental reappraisal, really, of what China's up to, what its strategy has been that we haven't realized, we haven't understood. And I think that is all compounded by the widespread view in the U.S. and I think in many other countries, which I think is correct, that China covered up the coronavirus, what actually happened in China. They were not transparent. They conducted disinformation campaigns after that, and that's really causing a sea change in the popular view of China in the United States and elsewhere. So depending on who gets reelected, that change in public attitude will have an impact, especially on Biden. I think it will make him tougher toward China than was the case in the Obama administration. Whereas with Trump, even though he has been tough in the last 6 months because he thinks politically it's the right thing to do, after the election, he could turn 180 degrees and say to Xi Jinping, let's do our big trade deal, because that's what he really wants to do. He wants the deal of the century. And so he could ironically turned out to be softer on China than Joe Biden. And it's an issue, the whole issue should be a big part of the presidential campaign. But as I said a moment ago, there's been very little discussion in the campaign, and we have 2 debates to go in 4 weeks. Maybe we'll see more, but so far Biden has not really been in a position where he's had to express more than very general views on China.
We are running out of time, so let's quickly move to the South Korea to U.S. alliance. Okay. If Trump wins re-election, is there any possibility of pulling the U.S. military out of the South Korea, even pulling out of the ROK-U.S. alliance? You mentioned in a recent interview with the Politico, the possibility of U.S. pulling out of the NATO if Trump is re-elected. So how would you think?
Well, I think it is a possibility that he would pull U.S. troops out of South Korea and the alliance. I think the same is true of Japan, pulling troops out of Japan and the alliance. I think it's possible. I think all these things are terrible ideas, but I think it's possible he could pull out of NATO too. He has a very transactional view of alliances. So in the case of South Korea, he said to President Moon, we're here defending you, and yet you have a big trade imbalance with us. Well, the trade imbalance is an issue, and trade issues are always on the table between 2 big economies. So that's sort of a given. But the United States is not in South Korea to defend South Korea alone. We're there because we think it's in our mutual interest to have a strong position against possible North Korean aggression, and to help stabilize Northeast Asia and really all of Asia and the Pacific. That's what I think the policy we were pressing for a free and open Indo-Pacific is all about.
Is running out of. So if you have anything you would like to say to Korean readers, please say the last words.
Well, look, I believe very strongly in the ROK-U.S. alliance, and I think we are both best served when we don't allow the North Koreans or the Chinese to drive a wedge in between us. I think the U.S. would like to see South Korea become more engaged with others in Asia, and of course we've got Japan. That's the first subject. I understand this is hard. It's hard for the Japanese too. But in Asia, unlike in Europe where we have NATO, we still don't have sufficient alliance structure. I think there's been a lot of conversation at the suggestion of Japanese Prime Minister Abe for this quadrilateral dialogue with India, Australia, Japan, and the United States, which is fine. South Korea ought to be part of that. Singapore ought to be part of that. Others should be part of that. And I hope this is something that people debate in South Korea and discuss and see that it's in their interest to join in that larger effort.